Welcome back to the Monday Muse. I'm Lee Benson. Today, I am talking about Viktor Frankl's spiritual unconscious, as well as unconscious religiousness, and his criticism of Jung and Jungian archetypes. Before we begin, please like, comment, share, subscribe, do all the things, help me to appease the fickle and pernicious algorithm gods. So in one of Viktor Frankl's works, he talks about this distinction between the spiritual unconscious and the unconscious religiousness, as well as the distinction between spiritual unconscious and instinctual. Because he believes that in the unconscious lives both the instinctual nature of man as well as the spiritual nature of man. That means that they have their own separate contents. So he says it's important to make a fine distinction between what is the spiritual unconscious and its contents and the instinctual. But he says that the primary existence of man is not instinctual. The primary existence of man is spiritual existence. So what he actually elaborates is that the distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness is not as important as the real distinction. And this real distinction is the distinction between what is instinctual and what is spiritual. If you know anything about Viktor Frankl, one of his main thrusts or one of his main founding ideas behind his philosophy is the authentic existence of man. What makes man's existence authentic? And for Viktor Frankl, it's responsibility, it's freedom of choice, it's doing, it's being able to choose, not being driven. So he sees this distinction at the spiritual part of man is the part of man that allows him to choose, allows him to live authentically. The instinctual part of man is the part that kind of drives him. You know, we are driven to drink when we're thirsty. We're driven to eat when we are hungry. That can't be authentic existence. The purely instinctual part of man can't be authentic. Only the spiritual. So for Frankl, being human is not being driven, but deciding what one is going to be. This is very existential. He gets a lot of this from Martin Heidegger and his existential philosophy. So being human is being responsible and responsible for one's own existence. So existence, if it's going to be authentic, even if it's unconscious, man can still live authentically so long as he is not driven and he is responsible for his actions. So existence, authentic existence, is present where there is a self, he says, that is deciding for itself. This is the spiritual aspect of man. Instinctuality doesn't necessarily decide, but the spiritual existence of man can decide. So spiritual unconscious has to do with man's existence, and the instinctual unconscious is man's facticity, the facts of his existence. So what we can say is that spiritual unconscious has to do with the core of human existence, the depth of human existence, and perhaps even the height of existence. It pertains to the essence of humans. Instinctual unconscious, on the other hand, deals with the somatic, that is the physiological and the psychic facts of man. So it's the psychological and physiological existence of man. The essential problem and distinction for Frankl is between the spiritual existence and the psychological existence, or the psychophysical existence. So it's not, is something conscious or unconscious? Is it purely instinctual, or is it spiritual? Because the spiritual can be both conscious and unconscious. So it's not a matter of, is this something that's born in the depths of man that he's not aware of? That's not the problem. But it's, do we primarily see human existence, authentic human existence, as just instinctual? So Frankl holds that the core, that the person has a core, and this core is the center of spiritual activity. The personal center is encompassed by a peripheral existence of psychophysical layers, the psychophysical facts. So a person has these psychophysical layers, whereas the person is spiritual. The essence of human existence, again, is not something that I have, but is something that I am. Frankl says, I do not have a self, I am a self. So being centered around this existential, personal, and spiritual core, the human being is not only individualized, but is also integrated. For Frankl, the spiritual core, and only the spiritual core, constitutes oneness and wholeness in a person. So wholeness means integration of the somatic, psychological, and spiritual aspects of man. Without this spiritual core, this essential spiritual ground, this wholeness cannot exist for Frankl. If we speak only of the body and only of the psyche, then wholeness has eluded us. That's what Frankl asserts. So thus, the spiritual phenomenon may be unconscious or conscious for Frankl. The spiritual basis of human existence is ultimately unconscious. The center of the human person in his very depths is unconscious. In its origin, the human spirit is the unconscious human spirit at the deepest core of the person. At our deepest core, there is something unknown, therefore unconscious for Frankl. So he uses the example and the image of the eye. He says, precisely at the place of its origin, the retina of the eye has a blind spot where the optic nerve enters the eyeball. Likewise, the spirit is blind precisely at its origin. Therefore, no self-observation, no mirroring of itself is possible, where the spirit is original spirit. So this basis of the person, or the kind of foundation that the person is essentially spiritual, their core is spiritual, and that this core can sometimes be unconscious, forms the basis for Frankl's thought on unconscious religiousness. Unconscious religiousness is understood as the latent relationship to transcendence inherent in man. One might conceive of this relationship in terms of a relationship between the eminent self and the transcendent thou. If you know the writings of Martin Buber, he talks about the I-thou relationship. So the I is you, and the thou is this transcendent other, God in this case. However, if one wishes to formulate it, we could be confronted with the idea or the term transcendent unconscious as part and parcel of human unconscious. So this concept means no more or less than that man has always stood in intentional relation to transcendence, even if on an unconscious level. We have this relationship to the other, the thou, the transcendent God, even if we don't realize it. If one calls the intentional referent, this other of such, the unconscious God, it is apt to speak of a God of the unconscious. However, what this can imply, or what this does not imply, is that God is unconscious to himself, of course, but rather that God may be unconscious to man, that man's relation to God can be unconscious. When we talk about God's unconsciousness or unconsciousness in God, for Frankl, he's not talking about that God doesn't know himself, but rather that we do not know God. Sometimes we have this, again, unconscious relationship to transcendence in our lives that we're not aware of. To make this argument, he references the Psalms and says that the Psalms make reference to the hidden God, and Hellenistic culture has an altar dedicated to the unknown God. Paul, when he's in Athens, in Acts chapter 17, I believe, he speaks to the men of Athens. The Stoics are there, the Epicureans are there, and he says, I notice that you are very religious men, and you have altars to all these different gods, and you even have an altar to the unknown God. That God that you worship in an unknown way, I now proclaim to you. So the unconscious relationship you had with this unknown God, I am now unveiling to you. Revelation, I'm unveiling it to you. So in a similar way, our concept of an unconscious God refers to man's hidden relation to a God who is himself hidden. So above all, man's unconscious relationship to God, for Frankl, is profoundly personal. The unconscious God must not be mistaken as an impersonal force that is operating in man. This is where Frankl critiques Jung. He says that this was the great mistake and the great misunderstanding that Jung fell prey to. Jung, he says, must be credited with discovering the distinctly religious elements within the unconscious. But Frankl's critique is that Jung misplaced the unconscious religiousness of man, failing to locate the unconscious God in the personal and existential core of religious man. That it was this existential religion that man had a relationship to this unknown God. Instead, Jung allotted the unconscious God to the drives and instincts, he says, where unconscious religiousness is no longer a matter of choice and decision, but rather, according to Jung, something within me is religious, but it's not I who am religious, but something drives me to God, but it is not I who make the choice and take the responsibility. Again, this is a big problem for Frankl. For Frankl, human existence is responsible existence. Authentic, genuine human existence is one in which a self is choosing and deciding and willing. So he's going to have a problem with anything that hints at the fact that I'm driven to something. If I'm driven towards religion, it's not real. It's not true or authentic religion. So for Jung, unconscious religiousness is bound up with the religious archetypes belonging to the collective unconscious. For him, unconscious religiousness has really nothing to do with personal decision. This is Frankl's commentary. But it becomes essentially impersonal. It becomes collective, typical, archetypal process occurring in man without man's choosing it. However, in Frankl's mind, his contention is that religiousness could emerge at least of all from a collective unconscious, precisely because religion involves the most personal decisions man makes, even if only on an unconscious level. It can't be something I'm driven to. Again, it's not necessarily unconsciousness that's the problem. Frankl's okay that we might have an unconscious spiritual relationship with something. It's when we move that unconsciousness into the realm of instincts that he has a problem. So that man is driven unconsciously in a spiritual fashion to God is not his contention. It's in his mind, Jung puts religion in the realm of instincts, and that pushes man to God. But there is no possibility of leaving such a decision to religion or to pursue God to some process, he says, that's merely taking place within me. If the process is only taking place within me, then I can't really be said to be religious or to have a relationship to the transcendent. So for Jung and Jungians, unconscious religiousness has always remained something more or less instinctual. But some sort of religion, or this is Frankl's quote here, but he said, but what sort of religion would that be? A religion to which I am driven just as I am driven to sex. Frankl says that he would not give a damn about religiousness that he owed to some religious drive. Genuine religiousness has not the character of drivenness, but rather that of decidingness. So he says that religiousness stands with its decidingness and falls with its drivenness. In a word, religiousness is either existential or not at all. That's the core of Frankl's critique of Jung. So going on, Jung, however, the unconscious, including its religious aspects, is something that determines the person. So in contrast, Frankl says, we contend that religiousness, or that the religious unconscious, and for that matter, the spiritual unconscious, is a deciding, a being unconscious rather than a being driven by the unconscious. So as we see it, the spiritual unconscious, and even more its religious aspects, that is to say, what we have called the transcendent unconscious, is an existential agent rather than an instinctual factor. As such, it belongs to spiritual existence rather than psychophysical facticity. This, however, was completely neglected by Jung, he says, when he wrote that archetypes should be understood as structural properties or conditioned characteristics of the psyche, which is in some way connected to the brain. Thereby, religiousness becomes entirely a matter of psychosomatic conditions of human existence, while it is really a matter of the spiritual person who builds on these conditions. Remember the differences that Frankl asserted between the psychological and physical facts of man and the spiritual existence, which is the core of man, and from that core, these other physical facts can be built. So as Jung saw it, these religious archetypes are impersonal forms of the collective unconscious that can be unearthed, he says, in more or less preformed psychological facts. As such, they belong to the realm of the psychophysical facts of man and not his spiritual core. From this religion, they operate as kind of autonomous powers. Autonomous in the sense that they're independent of personal decision. But, as Frankl says, our point of view, however, is that unconscious religiousness stems from the personal center of the individual man rather than an impersonal pool of images shared by mankind. So for Frankl, if we respect the spiritual and existential character of unconscious religiousness, rather than putting it into the realm of psychological facts, it becomes impossible to regard it as something innate. Since it is not, for Frankl, since religion and spirituality, or the spiritual core of a person, is not tied up with something hereditary or biological, it cannot be inherited either. And he says that this is not to deny that religiousness always proceeds within certain pre-established forms and patterns of development, but these are not innate. He says inherited archetypes cannot be innate. He doesn't believe in them, but rather they're given cultural molds into which personal religiousness is poured. This world of symbols, he says, is not inborn in us, but we are born into the world of symbols. There's nothing innate about archetypes or inborn about symbols for Frankl. Thus, there are religious forms, he says, and they wait to be assimilated by man in an existential way, that is, to be made his own. But what serves this purpose is not any archetype, he says, but rather the prayers of our fathers, the rites of our churches and synagogues. Culture offers enough traditional molds for man to fill with lived religion. No one has to invent God. No one carries him along in the form of an innate archetype. That's the core of Frankl's criticism and critiques of Jung and his theory of archetypes. Now, this personal center of the individual is understood for the Christian to be the soul. Furthermore, we could say that this deepest center of the soul, the center of the center, if you will, is God himself dwelling in silence and hiddenness. Jung's explanation of archetypes as coming from hereditary background or ancestors is interesting, but it does leave open the question where the first archetypes came from. How did the first generation of people come to form archetypes? So the first generation, obviously, could not have inherited archetypes. There was no one to inherit them from. So where do these kind of metaphysical or ethical content of archetypes, the feelings associated with these contents, where do they come from? So the archetypes must have originated from another source. And I would submit that one plausible source of archetypes is the soul. More specifically, the powers and acts of the soul. The soul is endowed with the ability to have numinous experience, religious intuition, and of course, the conscience. All of these elements are in some ways bound up with the contents and the experience of archetypes. So to explain the cross-cultural similarities among archetypes, Jung says that we have received these archetypes from a common ancestor and a common generational or ancestral pool of images. However, if we take that God exists and the soul exists, then the common source of archetypes is in the transcendent reality working in the soul. This shifts the common source of archetypes from a common inherited memory to a common transcendent reality. The absence of the soul and the transcendent reality connected with the soul makes the cross-cultural presence of archetypes very difficult to explain. Now, Jung does kind of sometimes conflate, or he makes various statements about God and the unconscious, and he says that it's hard to discern the difference between God and the unconscious. Although there are times where he seems to clarify and say that I'm not saying that God is the unconscious or vice versa, but that they both behave the same way. Both the unconscious and God are obscure and they're hidden. Both act as sources of inspiration and sudden insight. So there's this unknown mystery to the both of them, and what they are at their core is impossible for us to know. I would like to explore this idea of the source of archetypes in God and in the soul some other time, but for now, I think I will end it there. Thank you for listening. Remember, please like, comment, share, subscribe, do all the things. Help me to appease the fickle and pernicious algorithm gods. Additionally, if you have any questions, you can email me at BasicallyRelatedPodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next week.